Hello there. So last lesson we were looking at the policy of appeasement, where Britain and France were giving in to Hitler in exchange for peace. And we looked at all the positives and negatives of that. What we're doing in today's lesson is we're going to have a look at something called the Sudeten crisis. This is where appeasement was most famously used in the 1930s. So our question today is, what was the Sudeten crisis and what was its impact? If you could write that down as your title today, that'd be fantastic. So what we're going to do by the end of today's lesson, we're also going to be looking at this in the next lesson as well, is we're going to make and justify a reasoned judgment as how significant the Sudeten crisis was, both for Hitler and as a cause of World War II. So we're going to begin by describing those events and leading on to what was known as the Munich Agreement, and we're going to be able to explain the significance of those events. So please make sure you pause and get the title written down now. As I just said, appeasement is what we looked at last lesson. This is where you give your enemy something that they want in order to avoid conflict. So during the 1930s, Britain had decided not to stand up to Hitler and oppose or go against his aggression. Every time, remember, he took something, we backed down and gave in to Hitler's demands. And that was called the policy of appeasement. Make sure that you've already got that definition in bold written down somewhere in your exercise book, please. The very best and most famous example of appeasement in action was in the Sudeten crisis in 1938. So, as it says here on the slide, by 1938, Hitler had grown in considerable confidence. Remember that he'd already got away with so much by this point. Let's think back on what he'd already been able to achieve. He'd already rearmed Germany. He'd done that secretly, remember, for 2 years, and then he'd done it out in the open from 1935. He'd been encouraged in that by countries such as Britain in the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Also, in 1935, when he held his military rally, nobody tried to stop him. He'd also grown in confidence because he'd been able to put his troops back here in this piece of land between Germany and France in the Rhineland. That had made him feel a little bit like nobody was going to stop him. Of course, really famously, he had taken over Austria in 1938 in the Anschluss. So Germany was getting bigger and bigger, stronger and stronger, and Hitler was feeling more and more confident as time went on. He got away with so much, even he believed there was no stopping him. And that's really important. If you break the rules and nobody does anything about it, you continue to break the rules. So in March of 1938, Hitler began to turn his attention to the German-speaking people in what was called Czechoslovakia at this time. So Czechoslovakia had been a new nation created in 1919 under the Treaty of Versailles. So we can see Czechoslovakia here. And you can kind of see why it kind of fits naturally into Germany and why Hitler might have wanted it, because it's kind of almost as if Germany is incomplete without this piece of Czechoslovakia. So let's look at Germany. I always like this because it's almost like it's kind of Germany is a wolf, and in his mouth is the Sudetenland in this part of Czechoslovakia. So the area that he was most interested in taking over was called the Sudetenland. So it's these bits here that are in purple that kind of surround most naturally Germany. That's where most of the German speakers within that country lived. Feel free to write a couple of background notes on the Sudetenland and on what Hitler had already achieved. Your job over these next few slides is to take a few notes. So what I would advise you to do before we get started is to take a double page in your exercise book if you have your exercise book with you. If not, have a piece of A4 paper or just do it wherever you can. And you're going to divide your book up into 3 parts. What did Hitler want? What were his intentions? What happened? Now, this is going to be the biggest section. You might want to make that the kind of widest section in your table if you are doing it as a table. And what were the consequences? So they're the 3 areas that we're going to examine in today's lesson. So pause the video here and give yourself time to make something like this. Then is for our first column, that first part of your table that we've just drawn. So what did Hitler want? What were his intentions? What was it all about? So what the Sudeten crisis was all about was the fact that a large number of Germans lived in Czechoslovakia. They lived in this area of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. In fact, it wasn't just a few, it was 3 million people of what they called Germanic origin. So this area was very important to Hitler because remember, one of his foreign policy aims was to bring Germans back into Germany, reunite German speakers. That's one of the things that he set up from the very, very beginning. There was an issue with it though. It was really heavily defended. It was quite a wealthy and good place. It also had great railways. That was going to be really useful if you took it over. It had lots of factories and industries. And very, very importantly, as part of the Sudetenland was something called the Skoda Works. This was the world's largest and most modern armaments factory of the time, the best of the best. So if he managed to take over the Sudetenland, not only would he be able to reunite those 3 million Germanic people into Germany, but it'd also take all of those railways, all of those defences, and all of those wonderful factories, including that massive one. And it was rich in many other natural resources. This was a piece of land well worth taking. It would also help him achieve Lebensraum, getting extra living space for the German people. Not all people who lived in the Sudetenland, of course, were German. So this wasn't taking over German territory. This was also taking over some foreign territory as well, land that had never been German. So what I want you to do is pause this section now and just jot down some notes into your first column of your table. This is now the second part of your table and what actually happened in the Sudeten crisis. So let's have a look at the key events. So it all started in September of 1938. So what we had was the Sudeten Nazi Party. They rioted and they demanded union with Austria. Now this was really similar to what had happened in Austria as well earlier in the year. And just like in Austria, Hitler accused the Czechs of treating the Germans badly. They accused them of atrocities, of doing bad things to the Czechs who lived there and treating them less well than the Czech population. And he threatened military intervention. In other words, he threatened to invade. This immediately got the world in panic because it seemed as if Hitler might actually go to war over the Sudetenland. So Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, decided to fly to Germany, went to Berchtesgaden and agreed that the people of that area, so a particular part of the Sudetenland, not the whole of the Sudetenland, they'd get a vote about what should happen to that region. Would they stay as part of Czechoslovakia or would they become part of Germany? Hitler said to Chamberlain, if you give me this vote, this will be the last problem. I won't cause any more bother. And because of that, and because it was going to be a vote, Chamberlain got the Czechs to agree. They also thought, well, this might end this trouble and threat of invasion. So it looked as if the crisis had been dealt with. So Chamberlain flew home feeling really good about himself, that he had helped to stop a world war and a crisis. Next week, Chamberlain went back to Germany, this time to a place called Bad Godesberg, and he met Hitler again. He was just returning just to arrange the deal of how the vote was going to happen and what should happen next. At this point, Hitler made more demands. He wanted all of the Sudetenland and he wanted it handing over. Chamberlain refused this. He couldn't just hand over the Sudetenland. But as he returned home, he saw this as a quarrel in a faraway country. He thought it was a terrible thing that Britain could be plunged into another hideous war because of something so far away. And war at this point looked almost inevitable. When Chamberlain returned to Britain, he began preparations for war, such as enlisting men into the armed forces and building coffins for all the people they were expecting to be killed. They also started to do things like arrange for the evacuation of children from cities. However, at the last minute, war was avoided. The very next week, Mussolini, remember the Italians are allies with Germany, he ordered a four-power conference or organised a four-power conference at Munich. So this was where Italy, Britain, France and Germany would get together to try to avoid war and decide what was going to happen with the Sudetenland. Well, what was arranged was Chamberlain, Mussolini, Daladier, the French Prime Minister, they met Hitler at Munich and they simply gave the Sudetenland to Germany. Czechoslovakia was not even invited. So Hitler got exactly what he wanted. Chamberlain gave Hitler exactly what he said he wouldn't do because he was prepared to give away the Sudetenland in exchange for peace. Chamberlain flew back to England on the 30th of September with what was called the famous piece of paper. This piece of paper was where Britain and Hitler had signed the paper, and Hitler had promised that he would take no more. This was seen as the high point of appeasement and a triumph, because Chamberlain had stopped a certain war. People viewed Chamberlain as a hero. There was now not going to be a Second World War. But Chamberlain never fully trusted Hitler. In the background, he began to rearm Britain. He knew that this may not hold and that peace may not be something that was going to be long term. So from October, Hitler occupied the Sudetenland, delighted that he'd got yet another thing that he wanted. Pause this now and fill in the second box of your table. The final part of your table is about the consequences, the outcomes. So some people were absolutely delighted. They were happy with what had happened at Munich. So sometimes this is called the Czech crisis, sometimes it's called the Munich crisis, sometimes you might be asked about the Munich conference. Essentially, it's all the same thing. The Munich agreement was what was agreed and where Hitler was given the Sudetenland. Chamberlain called this peace of our time. Peace in our time. He said that he had stopped war. So one of the consequences was a feeling in Britain that Britain had now done everything they could. It demonstrated that the policy really wasn't that great, because all it did in the long term was it delayed war. War was going to happen because Hitler wasn't going to keep his promises. He didn't see Britain and France as being particularly strong. They had said no to him having the Sudetenland, but when he threatened war, they gave in and gave him exactly what he wanted. Most people in Britain and France didn't trust Hitler, and many countries now began to rearm very, very quickly. More and more people started to become critical of appeasement. They said, we've allowed Hitler to become too strong too quickly. And, that it was really Britain and France's fault for allowing him to become big and strong. Maybe they should have stopped him when he started rearming, or when he tried to remilitarise the Rhineland, or he took over Austria. But what it did do was buy the British and French some time. When we looked at the appeasement stuff last lesson, we saw that Britain and France weren't militarily ready before this point. Ultimately, though, Hitler did break his promises 5 months later. Next lesson, we're going to see about what he does in March of 1939. So finish taking notes into your final column now. Now, you saw a little bit of this video in the last lesson, but this is really good for consolidating the knowledge that we have learned today. And in particular, it's really good at looking at the reactions to appeasement and the reactions to the Munich crisis.
Now, Western Czechoslovakia was surrounded by the new Greater Germany. Here were the industrial powerhouses of the Czech state, the factories and the mines. Here, too, were fortifications vital for Czech defense. The Czechs had an efficient, well-equipped army, but against the enemy within, they had few defenses. 3 million Germans lived in Czechoslovakia, mostly in the frontier area called the Sudetenland. Propaganda from the new German Reich across the border was increasing the dislike and contempt they felt for their Czech rulers. In April 1938, Konrad Henlein, leader of the Nazi-backed German Sudeten Party, demanded self-government for the Sudetenland. It was a cruel demand. The Czechs stood to lose not just the Germans, but their industrial strength and their defenses as well. The Czech president, Beneš, seemed to have the choice of hanging on to the Sudetenland at the risk of war with Germany, or giving it up to live in peace. If he decided not to give it up, Beneš could count on the support of a Czech people angered by the Germans' demands. He could send out mobilization papers to his army and hope to call Henlein's and Hitler's bluff. Beneš could also appeal for help to France, Czechoslovakia's ally since 1924. But that was a prospect which alarmed the French government, led by Edward Daladier. In April, Daladier flew to London to sound out the British reaction. But he was to be told by Chamberlain to expect no help from Britain in a war over the Sudetenland. The Maginot Line was in fact where France's policy stopped. An immensely strong system of fortifications the French had built along the German border. This was France's answer to any future threats from Germany in the west. But from the concrete turrets of this expensive hidey-hole, the Sudetenland looked a very long way away. Hitler pressed harder. On Sunday, the 12th of September at Nuremberg, he demanded self-determination for the Sudeten Germans and threatened to send them military assistance. Taking encouragement from Hitler, the Sudeten Germans began to arm themselves. The situation threatened to embroil Europe in war, and Britain with it. The British Prime Minister, entirely on his own initiative, decided to intervene. He flew to meet Hitler, the German Führer, face to face in an attempt to save the peace. At Berchtesgaden, Chamberlain, without consulting his cabinet, the French or the Czechs, gave in to Hitler. He conceded self-determination for the Sudeten Germans. This was appeasement in action. Now his peace plan had to be put to the French and the Czechs. On the 18th of September, Daladier came to Downing Street to discuss the terms. Eventually, he too accepted Hitler's demands. Now everything depended on the response of the Czechs. If they decided to resist, they would have to stand alone. While enemy forces took up positions along their borders, they decided to accept the terms. A triumphant Chamberlain set off to tell Hitler the good news.
European peace is what I am aiming at, and I hope that this journey may open the way to get it.
Chamberlain's second journey to see Hitler at Bad Godesberg was humiliating. There were new demands. The Sudetenland must be surrendered at once. Polish and Hungarian claims on Czech lands must be met. Chamberlain refused to accept. Suddenly, war seemed very close. Flying back to London, Chamberlain looked down at the flimsy housing estates and pictured them laid waste by bombs. The Prime Minister expressed the anxiety and the puzzlement of his people.
How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. War is a fearful thing. We must be very clear before we embark on it that it is really the great issues that are at stake.
The Home Secretary made his appeal to the nation.
I appeal for 1 million men and women to help us with our work. I've had a splendid response. We are going to get our 1 million, but I want all you to come in and give in your names to help us in this great job.
Plans were made to move children out of the threatened capital. Hurriedly, more aircraft were being turned out. Britain's air defences were still weak and thinly spread. There had to be a way out. At the very least, enough time to get the aircraft program off the ground. When Mussolini suggested a four-power conference, Chamberlain seized the chance. Perhaps it was still not too late to settle the Czech question by international agreement rather than war.
When I come back, I hope I may be able to say, as Hotspur says in Henry IV, out of this nettled danger, we pluck this flower safety.
In Munich, Italy, Germany, France and Britain came to an agreement to hand over the Sudeten land to Germany. The Czechs were not consulted. They were free to resist by themselves if they wanted to. And the peace of Europe was guaranteed by another document signed by Hitler and Chamberlain, the famous piece of paper.
I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Posterity will thank God, as we do now, that in the time of desperate need our safety was guarded by such a man, Neville Chamberlain.
You could here in the consequences box also look at the reactions here, because clearly Chamberlain was welcomed back by the British people. The last thing for today's lesson is for you to make a judgment on whether you think Britain was right to follow a policy of appeasement. We already talked about this last lesson, but adding what you now know. So I'd like you to write a paragraph for your book answering the question. Use the information from today and what happened in the Sudeten crisis and with the Munich Agreement, and also with last lesson. You're also going to need that for the final plenary when you go back to the lesson today.